Cary Grant never won an Oscar, and that might be one of the biggest mysteries in Hollywood history. Here's a guy who made movies with Alfred Hitchcock, starred opposite Grace Kelly and Katharine Hepburn, and basically invented what we think of as the perfect leading man. But when it came to the Academy Awards, he got shut out completely. And no, it's not because he wasn't good enough. The real reason is way more interesting than you think. Most people assume Grant never won because the Academy didn't take him seriously or because he was stuck doing comedies. That's what everyone says, right? But that's not the whole story. The real reason Cary Grant never won an Oscar goes back to something nobody talks about anymore: the studio system, and how one man decided to fight back against it. Let me tell you what really happened. Back in the 1930s and 1940s, Hollywood worked completely different than it does today. The big movie studios like Paramount, MGM, and Warner Brothers basically owned their actors. When you signed with a studio, you were their property for years. They told you what movies to make, who to marry, where to live, what to eat for breakfast. I'm not joking about that last part. These contracts were crazy controlling. Cary Grant started out just like everyone else. He signed with Paramount Pictures in the early 1930s when he was still going by his real name, Archibald Leach. Yeah, that's right. Cary Grant wasn't even his real name. The studio made him change it. They changed everything about him: his accent, his hair, his clothes, even his personality. But here's the thing that made Grant different from other actors. He hated being controlled. Most actors back then just went along with whatever the studio wanted. It was easier that way. You got steady work, steady money, and if you played by the rules, you could have a nice career. But Grant wasn't like that. He was smart about money. He wanted creative control, and he definitely didn't want some studio executive telling him how to live his life. So in the 1940s, Grant did something almost nobody had ever done before. He refused to sign another long-term studio contract. Instead, he went freelance. He became an independent actor who could pick his own projects, work with whoever he wanted, and keep way more of the money his movies made. This was huge. We're talking about a time when going against the studio system was basically career-ending. But Grant pulled it off because he was already a massive star. He had leverage. But here's the problem. When you go against the system sometimes fights back. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences wasn't separate from the studio system back then like it is today. The studios had massive influence over who got nominated and who won. Think about it. The same executives Grant was fighting against were the ones voting on the Oscars. They were the Academy members. They were the people deciding who deserved recognition. Now, I'm not saying there was some huge conspiracy against Grant. That would be too simple. But when you look at the pattern, it starts to make sense. Grant got nominated exactly twice for Best Actor during his entire career. One nomination was in 1941 for Penny Serenade, and another in 1944 for None But the Lonely Heart. Both of these nominations came when he was still somewhat playing by the old rules. But look at what happened after he went fully independent. Some of his best performances came in the 1950s and early 1960s. Movies like North by Northwest, To Catch a Thief, An Affair to Remember. These are the movies we remember him for today. These are the performances that made him a legend. But did any of these get him Oscar nominations? Nope. He was the only lead in The Philadelphia Story not to get an acting nomination, and he was also snubbed for Bringing Up Baby and His Girl Friday. Think about that for a second. The Philadelphia Story is considered one of the greatest comedies ever made. Grant's performance in that movie is perfect. His co-stars, Katharine Hepburn and James Stewart, both got nominated. Stewart actually won, but Grant, nothing. Grant was so disappointed about not getting nominated for The Philadelphia Story that he joked, "I'd have to blacken my teeth first before the Academy would recognize me." That quote tells you everything you need to know about how he felt about the Academy's choices. Here's another thing that's important to understand about why Grant never won. He wasn't just fighting the studio system, he was changing it. Grant was one of the first actors to go independent by not renewing his studio contract, effectively leaving the studio system that controlled almost everything in Hollywood. When Grant went independent, he started making deals that gave him huge percentages of his movie's profits. He was making way more money than actors who stayed with the studios. He was proving that you didn't need the old system to be successful. This made him incredibly powerful, but it also made him a threat to the way things had always been done. The studios didn't like this at all. They'd built this whole system where they controlled everything and everyone, and here was this one guy showing everyone else that you didn't have to play by their rules. Other actors started following Grant's example. The whole system started to crack. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The Academy Awards weren't just about recognizing good acting. They were also about politics. Studio politics, industry politics, personal politics. When you voted for someone to win an Oscar, you weren't just saying they gave a good performance. You were also making a statement about what kind of person deserved recognition. Grant represented something the old guard didn't necessarily want to celebrate. He represented independence. He represented actors taking control of their own careers. He represented change. And change is scary when you're the people in power. This doesn't mean Grant's performances weren't good enough to win. They absolutely were. But when you're dealing with subjective awards decided by people with their own agendas, sometimes the best performance doesn't win. Sometimes politics matters more than talent. Look at who was winning Best Actor during Grant's prime years. In 1955, when Grant was doing some of his best work, Ernest Borgnine won for Marty. Great performance, but was it better than Grant in To Catch a Thief? In 1959, Charlton Heston won for Ben-Hur. Again, solid work, but Grant wasn't even nominated for North by Northwest, which is probably one of the greatest performances in movie history. The pattern becomes pretty clear when you look at it this way. The Academy was recognizing actors who fit their idea of what a serious, respectable movie star should be. Grant was too independent, too much of a rebel, too different from what they expected. But there's another layer to this story that most people don't know about. In the mid-1950s, Grant formed his own production company, Grantley Productions, and produced a number of films distributed by Universal like Operation Petticoat and That Touch of Mink. This wasn't just acting anymore. Grant was now competing directly with the studios as a producer. He was making his own movies, controlling his own content, and keeping even more of the profits. He went from being a rebellious actor to being a full-blown competitor to the system that had created him. Think about how that must have looked to the studio executives who were voting on Oscars. Here's a guy who not only refused to work within their system, but was actually competing against them. He was taking projects they might have wanted, working with directors and actors they might have wanted to work with, and making money that could have been theirs. The more successful Grant became as an independent producer and actor, the more he proved that the old studio system was outdated. And the more outdated the system looked, the less likely the people running that system were to give him their highest honor. There's also something else that worked against Grant, and it has to do with the types of movies he chose to make. Grant was incredibly smart about picking projects that would be popular with audiences. He wasn't interested in making important movies that would win awards. He was interested in making movies that people would actually want to see. This is where Grant was way ahead of his time. He understood that entertainment and art could be the same thing. You didn't have to make boring, serious movies to be a great actor. You could make thrilling, funny, romantic movies and still give brilliant performances. But the Academy in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s had a bias towards serious dramas. They thought comedies and action movies were less important than heavy, dramatic films. This hurt Grant because some of his best performances were in genres the Academy didn't respect. North by Northwest is a perfect example. It's a thriller about a man who gets mistaken for a spy and has to run across the country to clear his name. It sounds like a simple premise, but Grant's performance in that movie is incredibly complex. He has to be funny, scared, romantic, clever, and vulnerable all at the same time. He makes it look effortless, which is actually the hardest thing an actor can do. But because it was a thriller, and because it was entertaining instead of depressing, the Academy ignored it. They were looking for performances where actors suffered dramatically on screen, not performances where actors made difficult things look easy. Grant's comedy work suffered from the same bias. Perhaps it was Oscar's usual bias against comedy. but Grant also was ignored for Suspicion and North by Northwest. Movies like Bringing Up Baby and His Girl Friday are considered classics today, but they were just funny movies to the Academy voters of the time. This is ironic because comedy is actually harder than drama in many ways. Anyone can cry on camera if you give them the right motivation. But making people laugh while also creating a believable character, that takes real skill. Grant could do both, but the Academy only valued one. The timing of Grant's career also worked against him. He hit his peak during a period when the Academy was going through its own identity crisis. In the 1940s and 1950s, they were trying to figure out what movies and performances deserved recognition. They were dealing with changing audience tastes, the rise of television, and the slow breakdown of the studio system. In times of uncertainty, organizations often stick with what feels safe and familiar. For the Academy, that meant recognizing traditional dramatic performances by actors who worked within the established system. Grant represented too much change, too much uncertainty about what the future of Hollywood would look like. There's also a personal element to this story that's worth talking about. Grant was known for being difficult to work with sometimes, not because he was mean or unprofessional, but because he had strong opinions about how things should be done. He was a perfectionist who cared deeply about every detail of his performances and his movies. This level of control and attention to detail made him a better actor and producer, but it also made him enemies in an industry where ego and politics matter a lot. When you're voting on awards, sometimes personal relationships influence your decisions just as much as the quality of the work. Grant also had a reputation for being very private about his personal life, which was unusual for movie stars of his era. Most stars played the publicity game, attending every party, giving interviews, making friends with columnists and industry insiders. Grant did the minimum amount of this stuff that his career required, but he never seemed to enjoy it. In an industry built on relationships and networking, being antisocial can hurt you, not because your work isn't good enough, but because people vote for people they like and feel connected to. Grant's independence extended to his personal life as well as his professional life, and that may have cost him votes. But here's the thing that makes Grant's story even more interesting. Even though he never won a competitive Oscar, he eventually got recognition from the Academy. On April 7, 1970, at the 42nd Annual Academy Awards, Frank Sinatra presented Grant with a special Oscar for his unique mastery of the art of screen acting with respect and affection of his colleagues. This honorary Oscar came after Grant had already retired from acting. It was the Academy's way of saying, "We messed up," without actually admitting they messed up. They were acknowledging what everyone already knew, that Grant was one of the greatest actors in movie history. The timing of this honorary award is telling. By 1970, the studio system had completely collapsed. The independent approach to filmmaking that Grant had pioneered was now the norm. New Hollywood directors, like Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese, were making the kinds of movies they wanted to make, just like Grant had done 20 years earlier. The Academy was finally ready to honor the man who had been ahead of his time. But it took them until after he retired to admit it. Grant's influence on Hollywood can't be overstated. He didn't just change how actors negotiated their contracts, he changed what it meant to be a movie star. He proved that actors could be businessmen, that entertainers could be artists, and that you could be hugely successful without compromising your principles. Every actor today who has their own production company, every star who negotiates for back-end profits, every performer who insists on creative control, they're all following the path that Cary Grant carved out in the 1940s and 1950s. The fact that he never won a competitive Oscar says more about the Academy than it does about Grant. It shows how politics, bias, and resistance to change can affect even something as supposedly objective as recognizing good acting. Grant's story is also a reminder that awards don't determine legacy. Nobody remembers who won Best Actor in 1959, but everyone remembers North by Northwest. Nobody talks about the Oscar winners from 1940, but people still quote lines from the Philadelphia Story. The movies that Grant made during his independent years are still watched and loved today. North by Northwest gets shown on TV constantly. To Catch a Thief is considered one of Hitchcock's best films. An Affair to Remember is quoted in other movies and referenced in pop culture all the time. These movies have stood the test of time in a way that many Oscar-winning films from the same era haven't. That's the real measure of an actor's success, not whether they won awards, but whether their work still matters decades later. Grant understood this better than most actors of his generation. He wasn't making movies to win awards. He was making movies to entertain people and to build a career that would last. He succeeded at both goals, even if the Academy never recognized it with a competitive Oscar. The story of why Cary Grant never won an Oscar is really the story of how Hollywood changed from a controlled, studio-dominated industry to the more open, creative-driven business we have today. Grant was a pioneer in that transformation, and pioneers often pay a price for being ahead of their time. In Grant's case, the price was never getting the recognition he deserved when he was actually doing his best work. But the reward was a legacy that's lasted much longer than any Oscar winner from his era. Today, when we think of classic Hollywood leading men, Cary Grant is usually the first name that comes to mind, not because he won awards, but because he was genuinely great at what he did. He created a template for movie stardom that actors are still trying to follow today. His influence goes beyond just acting too. The way he handled his business affairs, the way he maintained his privacy while still being a public figure, the way he transitioned from being controlled by studios to being in control of his own career, these are all things that modern celebrities have learned from. In the end, maybe not winning an Oscar was the perfect ending to Cary Grant's story. It fits with his image as someone who did things his own way, who didn't need validation from the establishment, who was confident enough in his own abilities to forge his own path. The special Oscar he received in 1970 for his unique mastery of the art of screen acting was actually more meaningful than a competitive award would have been. It was the Academy admitting that they had missed something important, that their system had failed to recognize true greatness when it was right in front of them. Grant's career proves that sometimes the best way to get recognition is to not chase it. Focus on doing good work, stay true to your principles, and let history be the judge. In Grant's case, history has definitely ruled in his favor. So the next time someone asks why Cary Grant never won an Oscar, you'll know the real answer. It wasn't because he wasn't good enough. It was because he was too independent, too far ahead of his time, and too willing to challenge a system that didn't like to be challenged. He paid the price for being a pioneer, but he also got the reward, a legacy that's lasted much longer than any Oscar. And honestly, that's probably exactly how Cary Grant would have wanted it.